already been redeemed. Let's think about that for a minute. The purpose of the Torah was not to redeem the people. The people had already been redeemed by God out of slavery in Egypt. And that's a pattern that will continue throughout the history of the world. Why am I saying this? Before we can go into James chapter 2, Yaakov chapter 2, and look at the faith works situation that he describes there, we need to understand that in no place is Yaakov teaching that one can earn eternal life through the keeping of the Torah. Okay? That's not the purpose of the Torah. Christian thinkers for 2,000 years have confused that and have thought that the Jewish world, as well as, well, today, many people in my position, Messianic Jewish teachers, are teaching that the Torah grants eternal life. Or in other words, if I can put it in Jewish terms, opens the gates of entry into the world to come. What does that was what our Holy Messiah gave to us. Okay? The purpose of the Torah is to teach the redeemed people about their relationship with God and how to live our lives. That's why the Torah, I believe, is for you, as well as for me. God gave it to Israel to shine His light to others and as a teaching tool, and gave it to you as well as you are plugged into the root of the olive tree. It's one of the things that comes through the sap of the olive tree. Therefore, if you're hooked up to that sap, you'll be absorbing Torah with the branch that you are. Okay, why am I making that clear again? Because to understand what Yaakov teaches here, we need to understand that that's his background. That's what he saw the Torah as. So let's read some scriptures from the book of Yaakov, from chapter 2, starting at verse 14. We'll get to what's up there later. What good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? Now, the Greek word there for deeds is a word that means actions in completing what's written in the Torah. So in other words, when Yaakov is talking about deeds, he's not talking about earning your way to the world to come, and he's not talking about, I don't know, anything you might think it would be other than completing the teaching and instructions of the Torah. So he's saying, if I can paraphrase it, what good is it, my brothers, if a person claims to have faith but doesn't keep what's written in the Torah? Now, can you see to his mind, if you have faith in God and in His Messiah, that is based upon the teachings of the Torah. So if you don't complete what's written in the Torah, that is, keep the instructions that are written in the Torah, you've like started the journey, but then you jumped off a cliff somewhere on the way, and you didn't complete it. So he's saying here, you know, what good is it to start a journey and not complete it? If you believe in Messiah Yeshua, then you should be carrying out what's written in the Torah. That's his point. I wish people could understand this simple thing. If you have the background and understand how he's thinking and what his own roots are, Yaakov's that is, then you can understand what he's saying. If one doesn't understand what now you do from just this morning, then you can't look at this in the proper light. And you're thinking, well, he is contradicting what Yeshua says, for crying out loud here. He's saying you've got to do things to earn your favor with God. You don't. And again, let's go back to that original example. When did God give the Torah to Moshe? The Torah that first explained how God wanted Israel to live after the redemption from Egypt. Okay? And so Israel didn't have to, Israel had already been redeemed, already came out of slavery, like you and I did when we believed in Messiah. And therefore the Torah that we learn later is not given to us to do outside of what is given to us to do. So let's continue on here. And now Yaakov, in his very typically rabbinic way of teaching, will give an example for what he's talking about. Here he goes in verse 15. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, "Go, I wish you well, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about his physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Okay, so here's his example. Obviously, if you're the person who's cold and hungry, what you need is some food and a jacket to keep warm, a blanket or something, or be brought inside. If you tell me, "God bless you," he's saying, what good is that? It's not good. So in other words, he's saying that something needs to be done. And he's likening it to our situation. If we believe in Messiah, then we need to be doing the things Messiah taught us to do and instructed us to do. That's his point here. And when he says, where are we here? Can such faith save him at the end of verse 14? Let's be careful not to bring stereotypes of what's being talked about here. Many, many believers will read this and think we're talking about saving him by eternal salvation. And if you think that way, clearly then what Yaakov is teaching is contradicting what Yeshua did. Clearly. Martin Luther would be right. Because that's how he took it. But that's not what he means here. He's not talking about saving as far as eternal life. Okay, we have to find another way to understand this that makes sense with the history and with the context. So, and again in verse 17. We're in verse 18. But someone will say, "You have faith, I have deeds." Okay, now he's saying, let's not try to divide it up. Some of you might say, "Well, I have faith in God." Others of you will say, "Well, I do what's written." They don't contradict each other. You can't divide them. If you have faith in God, you'll do what he wants you to do. You'll live like he wants you to do. Example. If I believe that, let's take my father, for example, blessed memory. If I loved my father, I would do what he wants me to do. If he told me, "Hey, David, today I'd like you to trim the grass in the lawn." And, he did used to make me do that. That was my job. And he had a rather large lawn, so it would take me some time. Now, there were times where I would say, "Okay, I'll do it," and I did it, and my father was pleased. Now, he still loved me, whether I did it or not, right? That relationship was not threatened, but my daily happiness would be threatened if I didn't do what he asked, because there was a consequence for me. No going outside that evening, or no, visiting my friends that evening. If I didn't do it, he wasn't happy. Okay, in a similar way, if you say you have faith, but you don't do what your Father's will is for you to do, there are consequences. What's the consequence? Well, like Yaakov described it, you started out on the journey, but you didn't finish it. So, the encouragement here is not to divide faith from doing what's written in the Torah, but to see it as going along with each other. This is what he's explaining. Now, he didn't have to belabor the point too much because Messianic Jews he's written to would already know these concepts. But he does bring it out because apparently some people were trying to do what's written here and saying, "You've got great faith and I do what's written in the Torah, therefore maybe I'm better than you, or you better be like me," or something like that. I don't know what he's addressing. We don't know. But it makes a good point for us to understand. Unfortunately, this has been so misunderstood in church history that you get teachings like, all the things I've been addressing so far about how this is understood. This is not contradictory. Okay? This is very much just saying what we already know from the Torah, that if you believe in God, like if Israel accepts God as God, which Israel did, then God gave the Torah, and it's time for the people to live according to how God instructs. It's that simple. The Torah is nothing more. We translate the Torah often, our translations do, with the word law, and wow, that's inaccurate. Only 20% of the content of the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy is legal by nature, or can be really considered law. It's not, in its essence, law. They are instructions to help us live in a way that pleases God and that is consistent with who we are as redeemed people. That's what the Torah is. Okay, we'll continue on here. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do. Okay, let's take that in. Yaakov is saying, I will show you my faith by what I do. Now, he's not in a contest against anybody. He's saying here, the proof that I believe in God is that I live in the way he instructs us to. And that's very logical, right? We'd expect that that would be the case. And he's saying it is. And therefore, the aberration, the wrong, is the person who would say, I believe in God, but I'm not going to do what his instructions tell us to do. And again, unfortunately, in church history, the early church fathers adopted, I guess, that second viewpoint. That if Jewish people keep the Torah, we're now a new people, we replace Israel, and therefore the Torah is no longer a valid document for us. That's pretty much a summary of what the early church fathers believed, and that's seeped on into just many, many different denominations in the Christian world. Until today, it's pretty much the majority opinion of most Christian denominations. So you folks have had your eyes opened by God himself. And I can't tell you how encouraging it is to me. And I can't tell you, and I won't, but I'll tell you. It's encouraging to God, too. Truly. Okay. Another example. Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. The difficulty of that action aside, Abraham does it in order to obey what God's calling him to do. And Yaakov is using that as a prime example, that if you have faith in God, it's proven by how you live, by what you do. If you tell me that you love me, and then I see you abuse my children and hit my best friends, and you throw rocks through my windows at night, I'm going to pretty much doubt what you're telling me because your actions don't match your words. So Yaakov is basically saying our actions should match our faith. And there is no better way for that to happen than by following the Torah. Because the Torah is our God's instructions to us. Okay, and that's basically what he's saying here. This is not a complicated message. It's just one we need to look at with the right foundation, and then I think it begins to make sense. And then he says, and Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He's quoting from the book of Genesis. And he was called God's friend. You see that a person is justified. He doesn't mean eternal justification that leads to the gates of heaven opening in the world to come. Justified in terms of the way he's living his life here on earth. He's justified by what he does and not by faith alone. Okay? Now, Jewish people are very smart, very observant. I don't mean religiously observant. Here's what I mean. If the Christian world tells the Jewish world, Yeshua loves you, and we're his representatives here on earth, and then Jewish people look at pogroms that were led by the church, the Holocaust in which large parts of the church were complicit, and the Crusades that were religiously motivated, and a lot of anti-Semitism today that the church keeps silent about, then you can understand why Jewish people would say the actions aren't matching the words, therefore the source is wrong. A lot of Christians ask me, why can't Jewish people see that Yeshua is the Messiah? It's so clear from the scripture. That's a large reason why not what I just said. And I know that because I was the same way. I too, until I was 19, believed that the Christian world can't represent truth, because look at how supposedly Yeshua's followers have abused my people. Okay, anyhow, just so you should know that, and I think that Yaakov here is basically telling us the actions need to match the words, and the actions are what's written in the Torah. That would match the words. Just think, if everybody who was attending church today, or some congregation of some sort, kept what's written in the Torah with the belief in Yeshua, what this world would be like. Wow. Well, someday it'll come.
Amen.
Verse 25, in the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? And the answer there is a rhetorical yes, she was. She was saved from being killed by the troops of Israel when my ancestors came into Jericho. Her life was spared. Everybody else died, her and her family. Why? Because she made a right decision. She took an action that furthered God's plan. And even though her own personal life may not have been very righteous, if she was a prostitute, scholars argue what that word means. But if she was one, as the traditional thinking goes, God was willing to forgive that and still spare her life. So, to conclude, Yaakov concludes for us in verse 26. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. So what a nice comparison there. You and I are alive. If our immaterial part, our nephesh in Hebrew, left, you're dead. You're flat on the floor. You're lifeless. And he said that's the way it looks. In reality, if you say you believe in Yeshua, but it ends there. It ends with those words. So when he's talking about doing things, again, let's summarize it by saying he's not talking about eternal salvation. He is talking about how we're supposed to be living and showing our beliefs. We talked about the concept of Asiyat Torah earlier today, meaning doing what's written. And we talked about how the Jewish understanding in the first century, which is being reflected here by Yaakov from the book of Avot, chapter 1, verse 17 in the Talmud, states it's not the study of the Torah that's the most important thing. It's the doing of it. That's what Yaakov is telling us. Nothing different than what the Jewish world believed and taught in Yeshua's time period. Okay? Now I want to just stop for a second and ask if you have any questions on this particular set of passages, because I know it's a problematic one in most of the Christian world. Please.
You want the mic?
I know I need one, so we have another one coming here. I'll just take 2 or 3 questions on this section, then we'll go forward.
Right, Dave.
In Deuteronomy 30 it says that this commandment which I give you today is not too hard for you, neither is it far off. Now in the King James it says it's not hidden from you, which is a different matter. But then it says, you know, that if you obey and do it, if it's in your heart to do it, then all these blessings will come. So we're taught today that the law was given to show them that they couldn't keep it. Yeah, here it says you can keep it, but they didn't keep it.
Yes.
And so James is saying, if you've got faith, then you will keep it. But the church today is saying you can't keep it. And the Jews couldn't keep it because they just couldn't, because they didn't have the Holy Spirit. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, clearly, the Holy Spirit issue is one, it would take a whole couple of hours to talk about that.
Just 2 minutes.
2 minutes, all right. The Spirit of God clearly had to be active in the people obeying God whenever they did. Now, one mistake I think we make, Mark, that might influence things, we tend to look at things so individualistically and think if this person is not able to keep the Torah, it's because he's understanding wrong or doesn't have the Spirit of God or something. I want to argue that in the Bible and in the future, God will judge us not just individually, but by nations. And therefore, when Israel at times wasn't keeping the Torah, it was a decision made by the religious leaders of the country to turn their backs on God. The priests, the royal family, and the elders didn't do a good job and led the people astray, and there were consequences for that. So it's not that they couldn't keep it. they decided we're not going to keep it because we like the idols, or we like what our eyes see, what our ears hear. You know, how does Paul say, the matters of the flesh, lust of the eyes, flesh. Yeah. So there were decisions made that brought on the inability to keep the Torah. But the Torah, in essence, as you were saying out of Deuteronomy, is possible to keep. Think of what, and I like the fact that many Christian people have said to me, probably to my wife too, has had this conversation even more than me, that God gave us the Torah to show to us that we couldn't keep it, and therefore we need Messiah, and he justifies us. But that totally contradicts what's written in the book of Deuteronomy. If and when Israel had failings in our history in keeping the Torah, it wasn't because the Torah couldn't be kept. Again, it was because of bad decisions that were made by our leaders that dragged the people into idolatry. King Ahab, for example, marries a Phoenician wife who was an idolater and could care less about the Torah, and Ahab and Jezebel sent the entire nation into chaos that way. God had to allow bad consequences to come. And that's what happens. But had Ahab really been responsive to the Torah and kept it like his relatives Hezekiah and Josiah would have done, and David and Solomon, and even to some degree Solomon, things would have been different. So that's how I think about it. Does that answer? Yeah, pretty much. Okay. Maybe one more question on this section, then we'll pull ahead. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, in the scriptures it talks about the house of Israel being divorced. Do you think with the Messiah coming again to take his bride, do you see a love for the Torah and the instructions of God being a big part of that coming back?
Very good question. Absolutely, I do, and it's because of what's written in Zechariah chapter 13 and then 14, which are two sections having to do with that, and Zechariah, the end of chapter 8, that shows what's going to happen in the future. Part of Zechariah 13, which sometimes we know 12 and 14 so well we don't really read 13 much, but it talks about an inner cleansing that God's going to do throughout the land of Israel, and how he's going to restore the people back to keeping the Torah and being his faithful covenant nation again. And part of that Torah issue, it's because we haven't understood that we still have a living covenant relationship with God that's made us more or less turn our back on the Torah. So for example, if you have a living relationship with a wife that you love, you will probably take actions to ensure that how you feel is how she's going to take it. So in other words, I'm not going to hit my wife. I'm not going to beat her. If I love my wife, I'm going to make sure that I'm encouraging her and affirming the person she is. I'm not going to try and hurt her. And however, if I somehow don't realize that my relationship with my wife ought to be that way, then I might abuse her, or I might ignore her, or something. And in a sense, the covenant relationship with God hasn't, in some sections of our population, has that affirmation, but in some it doesn't. People aren't aware that we have a living relationship via covenant with a God, with our God. And so, if a person is not aware of that, then comes the disconnect that we can see. But yes, that's going to be fixed in Zechariah 13. Absolutely. Okay, let's go forward. Now that we have that settled, you can understand just how rich the book of Yaakov really is. Look at all the things that are being addressed in what we have. And again, if we just add that he's emphasizing that because now that we're redeemed people, a la 2 Corinthians 5:17, and new people, redeemed new people, through Messiah, we have the ability to keep the royal law, to love our neighbor as ourselves, and we can keep what's written in the Torah. So he's saying that. Okay, let's have the next slide. We're going to talk about the Jewish vocabulary in the book, because it's going to bring us a little bit closer to what the book is and the world that it came from. I have a friend, maybe some of you have heard of Daniel Gruber. He's a Messianic Jewish author, a very famous one. He lives in New Hampshire in the United States. He's written a lot of books. He has a son named Isaiah, and Isaiah is a brilliant young man. He was a PhD student studying in Athens, Greece, studying Russian history. So as he's studying for his doctoral degree, he had a roommate who was a young man and also very brilliant, who was a physics student and a homeborn Athenian. So he's Greek. Now, Isaiah Gruber happens to be a Messianic Jew like his father. And so he decided he wanted to share with his roommate, who was not a believer as far as he knew. So he took a copy of the Greek New Testament writings, gave it to his roommate and said, "Have you ever read this?" And it's in Greek, you know, the New Testament in Greek. And it's his native language. So he looks at it and he goes, "No, I've never read it." Isaiah said, "Why don't you take mine, read it at your leisure, and tell me what you think about it." So he takes it. 3 weeks later, Isaiah is studying, and bursting into his room is his roommate, and he takes the Newer Testament that he had, and he throws it on the floor angrily. And he goes, "I don't know what you gave me, but this is not the good Greek I grew up with. This is not Homer's Greek. This is such a Jewish book with perverted Greek. I want you to know that." And he walked out. What does that story tell us? By the way, I told this story once, and you're going to hear something really funny. A young man comes up to me after my lecture, and he said, "Dr. Friedman?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "I'm Isaiah Gruber. He just told my story." And I look at him, and all I could say was, "I hope I told it accurately." And he said, "For the most part, you did." He was pleased with it. Isn't that wild? Anyhow, the Greek that the book of Yaakov is written in is Greek, but it smacks of so much Torah foundation and so much of the Hebrew book language that the only conclusion you could draw was that, okay, it's in Greek, but it's a very Jewish book, a very Torah-centered book. And if the Christian world would just draw that much of a conclusion, it would make me very happy. Okay, so why do we have the book of Yaakov in Greek? Probably the people who Yaakov was sending the scroll out to, the Jews who were in, as we talked about, Italy, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, were all Greek-speaking communities. And generally, Greek-speaking communities didn't know Hebrew very well. Yaakov, kind of like the diaspora today. The Jewish community, obviously, in Israel knows Hebrew very well, and we do our religious teaching in our schools, etc., in Hebrew. But in the UK, the Jewish community here, some people know Hebrew, but it will not be to the level where most Jewish people in the UK feel comfortable speaking to you in Hebrew, or even doing academic studies in Hebrew. They'll do it in English and maybe use some Hebrew. So what happens when an Israeli speaker who's Jewish comes to the UK Jewish community to speak? He will not speak in Hebrew. Maybe 10% of the people coming would understand him. He'll speak in English to meet the needs of the diaspora community, to communicate. Yaakov does the same here. He writes in Greek because he's dealing with the Greek speakers. And funny enough, Alexandria, Egypt, was a city with a very large Jewish population. Maybe even 100,000 Jewish people lived there at different points in the first century when Yeshua and when Paul and when Yaakov were alive. But their knowledge of Hebrew was so weak that the Septuagint, maybe some of you have heard of that, which is a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, had to be made in Alexandria, because most Alexandrian Jews, a few centuries before, couldn't read the Bible. Alexandria is just, I don't know what, 100 and some miles from the border of Israel. You wouldn't think that knowing Hebrew by that big Jewish community would be such a problem, but it was, for some reason. Hebrew scholarship was not good in the ancient world outside of Israel. So all that I was talking about before about memorizing the scripture was either in Israel or in Babylon. In other words, Iran and Iraq of the ancient world. That's where the Hebrew scholarship was high. So in the Greek-speaking communities, generally speaking, the rabbis in Israel, if they would write to them, would write or communicate, would do it in Greek. Okay? And this is why we haven't understood quite a bit that even though the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are all written in Greek, they probably had a Hebrew original that was, first of all, communicated by mouth. And then the theory goes, and it's just a theory, but I think it's fairly accurate. This is put forth by Dr. David Biven, one of Israel's leading Greek scholars, and Dr. Robert Lindsay before him, his mentor, both Jerusalemites. Dr. Lindsay was a Southern Baptist scholar. And they both believed that the Gospel of Matthew, as the church fathers attested to, was written first in Hebrew. And then it was copied. And they believe something similar happened with Mark, Luke, and John. So we have some wonderful things in the Gospels that are written in Greek but reflect Hebrew, just like this will. We'll go into it in a minute. In the Gospels, Yeshua is called Rabbi. And it's straight in the Greek, Rabbi. Rabbi is not a Greek word. It's Hebrew. So there is a word in Greek they could have called him if they wanted to call him teacher and just translate it straight into Greek. But it doesn't happen that way. The Jewishness comes through. The Greek word for Sabbath is Sabbaton. It's not a Greek word. It's a Hebrew word that's brought into Greek in order to make the point. Right? This is a very Torah-centered thing that is happening. So Yaakov probably had some of his students translate his teaching into Greek and would have it written down. This is very typical in first century Israel, and then sent off as a scroll into those diaspora communities so he could be understood. But it's funny, if you're Isaiah Gruber's roommate and you're looking at that Greek and you're thinking, my goodness gracious, this is corrupted language. It's more or less like when I hear Pidgin English, which is a Caribbean kind of English that's spoken in places like Haiti, Dominican Republic, maybe in Jamaica a bit. When I listen to it, I can understand most of what I hear, but it almost doesn't sound like English to me. Maybe like my English sounds to you. But it's corrupted. It almost makes you mad. You're thinking, that's terrible, the way you're using that. And what does that word mean? That's not an English word. So that happens as well, and like that. It's very similar. Okay. Now, importantly, when we're thinking about this, that the book of Yaakov uses a number of terms that come straight out of the Torah. We wouldn't know this if we just read the Greek. We have to make parallels back to the verses in the Torah. So, for example, Yaakov calls God the Father of lights in chapter 1, verse 17. Let me read that verse for you. And if you're just reading it, you're thinking, that's a nice description of God. And it is. But it comes from somewhere. It comes from the Torah. So in chapter 1, 17, it states, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. How do we know that God is the Father of the heavenly lights? Well, you've read Genesis chapter 1, right?
It's amazing.
Yeah. God created the light. He said, let there be light, and there was light, says our text in Genesis. Clearly what Yaakov's doing is just taking a description of his, and then these other verses I've written from Psalm 43 and 89 and 97, God and light are used together, light being a description of what God is like. He's light as compared to darkness. And you can look at all those scriptures. We're not going to read them now. But clearly, the foundation of calling God by this name is found in the Jewish scriptures, in the Torah. Look at all those scriptures where God and light are used with each other. And then chapter 1, verse 17 says, with whom there is not variation. In other words, Like Malachi chapter 3 verse 6 says, I am the Lord, I do not change. And that's what Yaakov's telling us. He's the creator of light, and he doesn't change. To write those two things, you have to have a Torah background. Because the gods or the idols of the Hellenist world, or the Greek-speaking world, where this was going to, didn't have that background. Their idols had nothing to do with light, and they changed all the time. In fact, the heart of the Greek idolatry was to try and get your idol, manipulate them somehow to do what you wanted them to do, which, by the way, matches Canaanite idolatry. That's kind of what idolatry is. But God's not like that. He sets his standards, and then he doesn't change from them. That's what Yaakov's telling us here. And again, this is not news to his audience, but he's just making kind of a little flowery beginning there in his talk. Okay, let's have the next slide, please. It continues on. I mean, we're going to do a little bit of this, but it goes throughout the entire book. There are words and phrases whose roots are in the Jewish world or in the Torah world, and there's no other way to see it. And that clearly is telling us what is the book of James. What is the book of Yaakov? It clearly is founded on the Torah. Okay, the word of truth is used in chapter 1, verse 18. Let me read it. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. Now, we can't even understand verse 18 if we don't understand the Torah root here. The word of truth, and there's your Greek, logo eletheos. It clearly means that, the word of truth is the Torah, right? That's an idiom that he's using for it. And then at the end of verse 18, he says that we're a kind of first fruits of all he created. We read through that and maybe we don't stop and think, how would anybody know what first fruits is? If you don't know Leviticus chapter 23, you couldn't relate to what first fruits is. But if you're familiar with that piece of Torah, you know what he's trying to say, right? He's trying to say that we're kind of a first crop of what God's doing. Kind of the first ones to go through history, through God's plan of redemption, being redeemed by him through the Messiah directly. Okay. Also, I have it there in verse 18. A parkin means first fruits. It was a wave offering with barley. So in other words, the priest would represent the entire people at the temple. He'd take some barley in a basket and wave it just after Passover to start the days of the counting of the Omer that we read about in Leviticus chapter 23. But if you don't know that background, you're missing everything he's saying, right? So we can see that that entire verse is based on two different idioms in the Torah. Chapter 1, verse 19 says, my dear brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And that's really nice, isn't it? I like people who are like that. But he's telling us something that's so founded on the Torah. And let's take a look at the word akusa used here in Greek. Everyone should be swift to hear, quick to hear. And we think it just means hearing with our ears what each other are saying. Now, it does mean that, but I want you to know that akusa, in my opinion, is the parallel word to the Hebrew Shema. And that means a whole lot more than just listening with your ears. Shema in the Torah is always used to listen to God. And not just listen to God, but the word Shema in Hebrew means to listen and then do what you're told. That's the correct definition of Shema. You'll see it used in the Torah like that. And so the concept is that Yaakov's describing a state of being where one's in a position to both hear and then do what's written. And here he might be actually paralleling in this verse, Exodus chapter 24, verse 7, where it says, the people said they'll do what God says, and then they'll hear it. A strange word order. God is speaking to them and saying, will you accept my Torah, basically? And the people answered back through Moses, and the people answer and say, we'll do it, and then we'll learn it. Then you tell us about it. Which means that word order, that the people's emphasis is on doing what God is instructing them to do. When Israel first agreed to do that, the entire nation, that is its elders representing the nation, agreed to do this and answered back when Moshe asked them if the people would do this. They didn't understand what all the 613 instructions that God gave them on Mount Sinai really were all about. Moshe hadn't taught them yet. Moshe hadn't taught the elders, and the elders hadn't taught the people yet. That came later. But the point is that, and maybe the point that Yaakov is using, is that we need to see that our attitude needs to be one of Shema, where you're hearing something and you understand that it's not a complete hearing unless the doing follows. And isn't that what Yaakov said in chapter 2? Faith without the deeds following up is dead. Okay, so same thing here. Shema, and let me just again remind you, when you're reading the Torah and you come to that word Shema, we get it in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You're not just supposed to hear that truth. That truth is supposed to seep into our being and dictate to us, or let me say inspire us, to live a certain way. There are consequences to believing in God. They're good ones. And these consequences have to be part of our lives, or we started out on the journey and we didn't get where we were going. Okay. Verse 22, I want to read this because this is a good one. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Now he's summarizing what he just said for us, and it can't be clearer than that, can it? And this is not something that's contradicting anything he said before. This is really a nice summary of everything he's been trying to tell them. Do it. Carry it out. And again, we talked about Avot, chapter 1, verse 17. Shimon ben Gamliel's teaching, which says it's not studying that's the main thing, it's the doing. That's what the Hebrew right after 122 means there. Lo hamidrash ha'ikar ela hamaseh. It's not the studying of it, that's the main thing, it is the doing. That's what Yaakov is telling us. Again, to repeat, very common Jewish view until today. For 2,000 years and even longer, the heart of the Jewish understanding of the Torah is that, it's good to study it and know it, but if we're not doing it, we're missing out. And Yaakov is just reflecting that whole thing, and basically adding, we should be at the chief end of doing it. We should be the head and not the tail, because we are full of God's Spirit. And so when we do the Torah, we can do it in love and shining a light. Have you ever noticed when Yeshua kept the commandments of the Torah, that he drew people to God? That's a conclusion. My first book I ever wrote was called They Love the Torah. It's a study on how Yeshua kept the Torah. I was amazed, going through the Gospels and looking at when he would do something, such as he healed some lepers, and then he sent one to the priest and said, show yourself to him so that the Torah of Moses will be fulfilled. The effect that had on that man was, think about it. He's going to have an effect. The man's going to be very grateful that he's healed, first of all, because that disease that he had was a horrendous one. We know that from writings from the first century that describe it. Yeshua heals him, and then he tells him to go and do what's written in the Torah, to follow it up. So the effect is to bring that man close to God in thanksgiving, and then the priest is going to see that this man who had been outside the camp because he was sick is now healed. It's going to have an effect on the priest too. There are ripples from the way that he kept the Torah all the times, the way that he kept Shabbat, got people discussing vigorously what Shabbat's all about, and he would teach them as he's doing things, and people are getting healed all the time. So he made waves where he went because of the wonderful way he kept the Torah. When we keep the Torah too, it should make some waves, some positive ones. There's always going to be negative reaction, but we'll have some positive reaction too. Chapter 1, verse 27. Let's read that. And we'll see again that there's a foundation here in what Yaakov writes in the Jewish world. He says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless as this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Now, think of how sweeping a statement this is. Religion before God and the Father, or if I can paraphrase it, religious practice. Practice that's connected to your faith, that's pure before God. What does he say? Just believe? No. He gets really practical. Remember how he said the book of Yaakov is practically, it's very practical. It's practically telling us how to keep the Torah. Help those who are hurting in your midst. And I can't think of people who hurt more than orphans and widows. That's what he's saying. He's repeating what he says in chapter 2, that these are the kinds of work or deeds or acts of mercy, if I can translate the Hebrew, the kinds of acts of mercy that prove that you have faith in God. Because if you love God, you'll turn around and love people. And the Torah tells us how to do that. Okay, so where does the idea, by the way, of helping orphans and widows come from? Yaakov doesn't make that up. And it's not because he's such a nice man that he figures it out. It's in the Torah. Exodus chapter 22, verse 22, and Deuteronomy 16:14. We'll read the Deuteronomy text. Deuteronomy 16:14.